So welcome to the Fundamentals of Sponsored Projects at CSU series. This is our last one. I cannot believe that this is number 8. This has been a fast month, but a long month. And we've had a lot going on. So today it's my pleasure to have Award Management Part 2. I am Shannon Irie, your moderator for this session. I am one of the training and information coordinators here at the Office of Sponsored Programs. We've made an interactive worksheets for each session that you can access on the OSP website. Not only do we have worksheets, but we also have the PowerPoint slides, and we have those so that you can take notes the old-fashioned way if that's what you want. But the worksheets are meant to be interactive, and they also do have some things for you to be able to do outside of these trainings. So sometimes there's a video, sometimes there's some matching games, things of that nature. So it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters for today. We have Catherine and we have Tiffany.
Thanks, Shannon. I'm Catherine Doris. I'm SRA for Team 5 here at OSP. So we cover College of Ag Sciences, College of Liberal Arts, Extension, and then a couple little units. I have been with CSU for 13 years, with OSP about half of those, and out in the College of Ag as a pre-award and post-award coordinator for about the other half. And in my free time, I'm a voracious reader, and I'm a member of the Fort Collins Running Club. So you can often find me trails and pads around Fort Collins.
Hi, everybody. I am Tiffany Roller. I am the SRA on Team 1. And the units that Team 1 covers is the majority of the School of Engineering, all except one department in engineering. We have the Energy Institute, and we also support the Provost's office. I have several years of grants administration experience. I think I started in 2008. A lot of that was actually on the sponsor side. And then I migrated over to University Research Administration in 2020, and I came to CSU. I'm the newest SRA on the team. I come from the University of Nevada, Reno, where I managed the pre-award processes and team for the central administration there. In my free time, I am primarily dog-centric. I have a husky and a corgi, and they keep me happy and they keep me engaged, and I'm constantly out walking them.
I've got to ask Tiffany, how does one walk a corgi and a husky at the same time?
With someone else helping.
I can just see that poor corgi's tiny little legs trying to keep up with that husky.
Yes, the husky wants to bound and run, and the corgi wants to put on the brakes, and so you can't do it without help.
So we're going to cover the sort of second piece of award management. Obviously, award management is integrated. You can't really fully separate programmatic and fiscal, but we're going to cover the programmatic side of things. So this is going to be things like award setup, agreement modifications, deliverables such as technical reports. As you'll see, a lot of things are tied in with the financial side, but we still kind of make this distinction between financial and programmatic for when we're talking about award management. And OSP is integral to the programmatic side. We're often sort of first line of communication with the sponsor when we're talking about the kind of award modifications that we're going to cover in this. I'm sure as you've been going through fundamentals, you've seen the life cycle of an award throughout. So we're really on the post-award at this point. So anytime, we have an award and we're starting to manage it, we're now talking about the post-award part of it. And again, we're going to just cover the programmatic management. We'll touch a little bit on budget and such because they can't be pulled out. So this is just a kind of a little graphic of the players involved. I'm not going to read it. You all will have a copy just to see. It really is once the PI starts, programmatic management kicks in, and occasionally it even starts before the PI starts their work. If an agreement for some reason comes in not as expected, the start date or the amount or something is wrong, sometimes OSP and the departments and the PI are working in concert before work has even started to make sure that we're fixing the award. So that's helpful for this.
And as Catherine mentioned, we work in concerts with all of our departments and units and PIs. It really does take a village. A sponsored project typically has a lot of moving parts with a variety of governmental, university, and sponsor-specific policies and guidelines that could impact the project, its budget, and its requirements over the life of an award. So successful, compliant, sponsored project management at CSU really is a shared responsibility between investigators, unit administrators, research program managers, fiscal officers, and the various units under OVPR. It really is a lift that we all share together. I sometimes call it a baton race where there'll be a part of it where it may be your part, and then you have to get it squared away so that the next person that's in line to take on the responsibility is set up for success. So as we move forward in today's slides, we're going to talk about some of the following activities related to modifications, award modifications, amendments, prior approval, what expanded authorities are related to awards, and also we'll touch on project closeout. Okay, so with the idea of change, it is very typical for an award to potentially change or a project to change in the middle for various reasons. So what do we do when an awarded project is shaping up differently than we anticipated, or there are unforeseen circumstances? So there are some post-award actions that can result in award amendment or modification. There are certain types of changes that actually need to be recorded as an amendment that will attach to the original award. And we're going to go over what those are in just a second. But after hearing this definition of some post-award actions that could result in an agreement or amendment change, maybe you can list in the chat what you think might be examples of award modifications or things that might result in sponsor change.
Okay, they're coming
budget
in.
Revision. Oh, yep. TE, budget revision, change of PI, scope change.
PI dying. My goodness.
PI dying.
Yes,
Well,
that would
yes.
be definitely a change. Absolutely.
Well,
But yeah, and also the statement work change. So any change in SAL. So yeah. Oh, we're getting more. Additional supplement or supplemental funds, addition of subaward. These are all great. Did we miss anything? Oh, did someone say no cost extension? They did in the chat. Yes, absolutely. Okay, and lots of NCEs. Okay.
Okay, so you can see these are the most common types of amendments, and I think we hit on most of them. Changes in cost share were one that we didn't mention. That might be something that would result in or need sponsor approval and result in amendment. Carry forward of budget into subsequent years. We're going to touch on that in a second. But before we do that, I think there's a stamp function that's in here. So if you can take your stamp, why don't you stamp which one you think is the most common type of amendment that we would process through SP. A whole lot of love there for no cost extensions.
Yeah.
And also budget revisions. Yeah. Yep. I would tend to agree that I think no cost extension is probably the most typical, and budget revision probably being second. So your instincts are on point there, team.
Yeah, I would think that during my 15 years that I was in a department, the one that I never saw was principal investigator takes a long break or disengagement. So
seen a couple
potentially I should have.
Yeah.
Potentially there was a need at some point in time for that, but I don't think that that's one that I thought about a lot, or was particularly in tune to. So I'm glad to see it on this list. Okay.
Yeah, Team 5 has had a couple where our PIs go on like engagement with one of our sponsors, and so they're actually on detail.
Everybody pick a different stamp. Tell us which ones you have the most experience with. Okay, so no cost extension being the most common, it stands to reason that you would have the most experience processing one of those with your partners in SP. Okay, we have some PI changes. We have a one scope of work change out there. Changes to subaward terms and budgets. A few folks have dealt with those. And then the one loan change in cost share. It is a more atypical situation. Okay, so again, this list is just the types of actions that typically we need to get sponsor approval for, and that can result in award modification. We're going to go over just a few of them. We don't have time to go over all of them today, but we're going to dig into a couple. So change in scope, which there were only a couple of folks that had experience with this. So what is a scope, right? So it's typically the technical narrative or the programmatic narrative that the PI has put into their proposal that's approved through the award. So a change in scope might involve changes to the objectives, changes to the aims or methodologies. It could be that there's a major budget change that's taking place that's also going to affect the way that maybe CSU's portion of the project is going to be executed. Maybe the subawardee has a different approach that needs to be recorded. So examples, again, the project's objectives are changing or the aims are no longer achievable. Maybe the aims are staying the same, but during the process of the research project, maybe the team has identified a more refined methodology. That is a scope change. And we mentioned subaward, if there's a change in key personnel or personnel effort. So let's say, a PI is reducing their effort quite a bit. It would be very typical for a sponsor to say, okay, well, how is that changing your objectives or your methodology? Because if the PI is not putting in that many hours, something must be changing. So with that said, a scope change is a type of modification that may go hand in hand with other kinds of changes. So again, if you have a major budget change, that could also be a scope change that needs to happen at the same time. So it will be typical for your sponsored projects team to ask you questions when you have other kinds of changes about whether or not a scope change is involved. So any changes to scope typically require sponsor prior approval before work in the revised format or the revised scope can move forward. So that's something to keep in mind. So if you're aware that something's changing, we should get prior approval for that before you start moving forward in that new format. This is definitely true for federal agencies, and it's likely true for most other types of sponsors. That is just kind of in a nutshell what scope change looks like. So budget revision. And I think the group here sounded like many of you have some experience with budget revisions. So this is probably the second most common type of request that we would field through sponsored projects and that could result in an award modification. So reasons for revising a budget would include something like increases or decreases to funding amounts. So someone mentioned supplement earlier. That might be something that would result in an award modification coming in. There's additional funds. There are rarer circumstances where, let's say you have a multi-year project with a federal agency and they are experiencing a budget shortfall from the federal government. That could trickle down to your award. And so we could, and it does not typically happen, but it has happened in some uncommon circumstances where we might get a modification that says you're working with 75% of your budget now. So that's going to be a budget revision. We've been told by the sponsor it's going to result in an award amendment. It could be an example of another kind of budget revision might be that an investigator could identify that they don't need as many personnel on the project. Maybe they budgeted for 3 graduate research assistants and they only need 2. And they have some cost savings there. And they might want to apply that money maybe over to the materials and supplies line item. So that could end up being a budget revision. So how are we going to know that? We're going to have to figure out whether or not the award that you have allows for those types of changes. So that's going to be the next thing that happens is you would work with your sponsored projects team, your departmental research administrator, your fiscal officer to determine what types of rebudgeting authority we have on the award. And we're going to hear about rebudgeting authority under expanded authorities a little bit later here. So with that said, I just want to touch briefly on kind of some working language that we have in sponsored programs, budget revision versus budget reallocation. Think of it this way. A budget revision is going to be the type of thing that results in an award modification. It means that we have to get sponsor approval before we can enact that revised budget. A budget reallocation is typically the kind of language we use to indicate that we can move a few things around on our budget because we already have some allowed guidance that allows us to do that through the award. So there are a couple ways that you can get to the information that might let you know which one it's going to be for you, whether it's going to be budget revision or budget reallocation. Again, always reaching out to your SRA or your fiscal partners to ask questions is a good approach. But there is also how they can navigate to this. You go to your MyRAM, you can visit the AAR page, the Administrative Applications and Resources page. There is a link that will allow you to click on your research project status RPS link. And then that's going to bring up a search box where you can put in your 53 number. And once you're there, then you'll see a link where you can click on the terms and reports to see your specific terms and conditions that apply to your award. It's not going to be exhaustive. It's usually short phrases. It might say something like rebudgeting limited without sponsor approval. It's not going to say what the limitations are exactly, but it's going to let you know that there's a flag there that, you know, we can't move things on the budget until we're sure that this doesn't require sponsor approval, or it may. Okay, so that's just kind of in a nutshell what a budget revision looks like. You know, those are typically going to also involve, you know, maybe a revised spreadsheet or revised workup document that we have to provide to the sponsor in addition to a justification that'll go in order to receive that amendment.
We have another question in the chat. Do you need a budget revision if, for example, there were savings due to no spending upon the initial receipt of the award? Takes a while to make a hire, and therefore there are some salary savings at the beginning of an award.
It would depend on the circumstances of this. So if your cost savings is the type where the work can still be accomplished with the shortened period and you're looking at those cost savings, you want to direct them to a different line item, like a total, you know, you want to buy a piece of equipment, or you know, utilize some additional equipment use fees or travel or something like that. That might result in a budget revision, because whenever you're moving categorical line items, and especially if the award terms don't allow for that, that might be the kind of thing where we need to do a budget revision. If you are going to be using the money in the same categories, but just over an extended period of time, that might just be more of an NCE and less of a budget revision. So it kind of depends on what you're thinking of doing with the money. Another type of modification or prior approval request that we might need to field is carry forward. So carry forward can be automatic. This means that from one budget period to the next, any remaining funds or any unspent funds could carry forward into the next budget period. Some awards are automatic, some are not. And if it's not automatic, we do need to request prior approval for that. We can't just assume that because, let's say, we have $5,000 left in the budget from a prior year, that we can spend it. There are some awards that might require us to even send it back to the sponsor. That's uncommon, but it's possible. So for most federal agencies, NSF, NIH, USDA, Department of Commerce, federal grants, carry forward is usually automatic, but it always does depend on the specific terms and conditions of the award. Some federal grants, it's more of an it depends. We know that going into it. So a couple of examples of that where SP is going to be on alert to make sure is NASA, Department of Energy. Department of Energy specifically will often have what we call go, no-go milestones built into the award, where there might be particular stop dates in the award where the grants management specialist or the program officer over on the sponsor side wants to see what kind of progress is taking place, or they might have other kinds of checklist items that they want to make sure are in place before they authorize carry forward or they authorize that next budget period. So those are some of the things that we're going to be looking for in the terms and conditions of the award to advise you when it comes to whether or not you can spend money from a prior period. State agencies or other sponsors, private sponsors, industry sponsors, they may also require a formal request to carry forward unused funds from one budget period to the next. And this is something to definitely note. Several of us have these awards out there, and those are from the state of Colorado. Should be noted, no carry forward is allowed. That's usually built into the terms and conditions of the award. And so going into it, if you have a state of Colorado award, carry forward is generally not allowed. All right, we're going to get to the one that everybody has the greater amount of experience with, and that's a no cost extension. So that's the extension of a project period without additional funding from the sponsor, meaning that's where the no cost comes from. So we're using existing funds, but we need more time to accomplish the aims and objectives of the project. So if the project's end date is approaching, and the PI has determined that there's additional research that needs to happen or additional programmatic work, then we typically need to request no cost extension. There are certain times where CSU can execute a first no cost extension automatically. Those are sometimes allowable on federal awards, and we'll get into that when Catherine talks about expanded authorities in a little bit. And in those cases where we have the ability to do a first NCE on a federal award, that's typically for up to 12 months. I have occasionally gotten questions in the past, or I've seen a PI ask for maybe only 3 months. And one of the questions that I'll have back to them will say, are you sure? Because if you need more time after that, that moves into a second NCE, which can be sometimes more complicated. So, you know, they will typically allow up to 12 months on that first NCE. And so unless there's a really good reason to, you know, super limit it down to only a couple of months, I usually am going to ask why we're not taking the longer period. When there are awards that are not federal with expanded authority, we may need to get sponsor prior approval. Either way, we need to have a good and appropriate justification in place. That justification needs to be related to the work on the project, the programmatic or technical work on the project. It cannot be, and this is something to note, it is never allowable for a no cost extension to be justified solely for the expenditure of remaining funds. Okay, the reason must be related to continuing work and work that's within the scope, by the way. So it can't, so this would be one of those things where we're going to take a look at that justification and if there's continuing work, but it sounds like it might be sort of an additional leg of or a change to scope. You might hear us also come back around to that. Does this represent a scope change? Hopefully not. An NCE should be the existing scope.
And Tiffany, I had a sponsor come back and tell us that that was not allowed. One of our PIs went right to the sponsor and said, I still have funds to spend. And the sponsor came back and said, absolutely not. So sponsors are also watching out for this.
Yes. Yeah, it's definitely probably one of the first things on their list that they'll look at is, are you just asking to use remaining funds or do you have a reason for this? Okay, so before we move to the next slide, in addition to having a justification, which we just talked about, can you think of any other items that you might need to provide to your partners in SP in order for us to request an NCE on your PI's behalf? Can you think of any other information that you would typically need to include in an NCE? Since you all have experience with this, I bet you have some ideas. So we've got some comments here on what might go in an NCE, a progress report. Very true. There are several federal sponsors where they want you to attach your most recent progress report, and they want to take a look at that when they're considering your request. Projected remaining funds, very true. And with projected remaining funds within the justification for an NCE, I've seen sponsors want to know what your planned use is for those remaining funds. It's usually a narrative. It's usually like a 1-paragraph type of thing, not necessarily a full-blown budget, but they want to know that you're thinking of the remaining money that you have and how it's meeting your needs for the rest of the research that needs to be done. Are there subawards that also need to be extended? Very true. Associated cost share accounts may need to be extended. All right, and so Kat here was saying, why are we requesting this 5 days before the end of the period of performance? So that's a good point to bring up, Kat, is that typically NCEs for different sponsors are going to have different periods of time they need to be submitted within. So it's something to keep in mind. If you hear from your principal investigator that they're thinking about needing an extension, let's have that conversation early. Some sponsors, they need to have that request in 45 days or more before the end of the project period. For some, it's 90 days. For some, it's 30 days. It's different depending on sponsor. So let's make sure that we're figuring out what that timeline is as soon as you know that you might need an extension. Oh, an extension after the period of performance, that's always a good one. I tend to say needs to be a robust justification meeting. You need to really make your case for that one, because and we would also advise it may not get approved, you know, especially if award terms sound like they wouldn't allow for that, and if you're very late. So we touched on most of this here, but this is an NCE request form that we have on the sponsored programs website. And why do we have this form? So as we know, NCEs are the most common thing that we field, and there's a lot of little detailed information that we need to gather on that. So instead of, you know, engaging in a 20 email back and forth chain, between us and you. It's great if we can have it all just centralized in one place. And then you also know what you need to get, because there might be questions that you need to ask of your PI or the rest of your team. So the general information on the form is the PI's name, department, who's the FO, who's the sponsor, what's the award numbers, what is your requested expiration date, justification, and as we mentioned, the amount of anticipated funds after commitments, and what's your plan for use.
And Tiffany,
Right,
some of this
so-
seems really basic, but remember a lot of your PIs have titles on their projects that are very similar. So if you don't
True.
give the exact title of what it is, it's hard for the people in OSP to decipher exactly which one that is. Not only that, but you might have several with the same sponsor with the same title. And that happened to me once on NASA. I had a PI who had a whole bunch of NASA grants, but they all were similarly titled, and we asked for a no-cost extension on the wrong one and sent it in. It was an email to the program manager, but the program manager kind of came back and said, "What are you asking for?" So you never want to look like that.
And your comment about program manager makes me think of another thing. On all of these, NCEs would be the most common one, but on all kinds of prior approvals, something to keep in mind is that OSP is actually the only office under the CSU umbrella that is authorized to contact the sponsor with formal requests when we're dealing with like an award modification. I know that we've seen a lot of folks out there. We have PIs that have reached out to sponsors with their own requests, and we'll work our way through it. It's not necessarily going to be an apocalyptic event if that happens, but it should come through SP. And the reason why is because we often have a PI maybe talking to a program manager or a program officer. The program officer may not actually be the person on the sponsor side that's authorized to give the approval. So even if they say they approve it in email, we still have to go through the grants management side. We still need to often have that documented in the appropriate way in the form of an amendment oftentimes. So just keep that in mind. If you know that your PI is doing that, we want to thank them for their effort and their help, but we need to redirect it back over to your SRA and your team on the SP side.
I was going to tag on to Tiffany's last point. We had a instance a couple of years ago where we had a program manager give approval for a budget change. And when it made it around to the grants management people, they said no. And so, we just have to make sure we're asking permission of the right people. So for these.
Before we go on, is there ever a reason for CSU to reach out to the program officer when they are the sub on a grant, or is that always going to defer to the primary OSP?
I'd say it's always going to defer to OSP, still as the primary requester.
Yeah, and I would also say that if we are a sub and the program officer is basically two levels ahead above us, right? Our sponsors want us to use the pass-through entity as our sponsor. So the first person that should be contacted through our OSP would be then the pass-through entity, not even the main sponsor. I know that that's a very convoluted thing to say, but remember, as a sub-award, our contracting is with whoever that pass-through entity is, not necessarily the prime. And so generally, we would never be contacting that program officer as a sub directly.
And I know which award you're talking
Okay.
about, Emily, and in this particular case, yeah, it would need to be Pueblo that would reach out to their program officer, and then we would deal directly with Pueblo.
Yeah, and our sponsors do not want to deal with our subs. So again, the contracting and the awarding is between the pass-through entity and that sub-award, not the prime and that sub-award. So.
Yeah, contractually, if we are a sub, we don't have the authority to go around our pass-through entity and go directly to the prime funder. So we need to be very careful with that. So do award modifications require sponsor approval? As always, the answer is it depends. There you go. Always, it depends. Fundamentally, all changes, all modifications require sponsor approval. The difference is just whether it's going to be getting an official amendment, whether there's going to be a award change, or whether we get the approval through these expanded authorities that we're going to touch on, which means we have the ability to make changes internally, that budget reallocation that Tiffany mentioned, without getting an actual formal amendment. But we still often need to be communicating with our sponsors, even if there's expanded authorities, that we have the authority to make that change. We still have to be letting our sponsors know that we're exercising those authorities, so that if they need to make a change to the amendment, to issue an amendment, make a change to that award, they can do that. So expanded authorities. Many of you have heard of FDP, the Federal Demonstration Partnership. That is where these expanded authorities came out of. So the Federal Demonstration Partnership was intended to decrease administrative burden for most common requests. So a lot of the ones that Tiffany has already covered. First, no cost extension, budget reallocation. They cover a lot, as you'll see in a couple slides. So as grantees, we are given authority over managing our grants. That is part of our, administrative burden, is we have the authority to manage our grants. Expanded authorities give us an even wider range of authority that we have over certain grants. So when we're talking about expanded authority, we're only talking about federal assistance awards. So that's going to be grants and cooperative agreements. So if you're talking about a non-federal sponsor or a federal contract, neither of those are going to be covered by expanded authorities. Just for these next few slides, we're really only talking about federal grants and federal cooperative agreements. And we're going to look at, no, you're fine. There's a prior approval matrix, which you often hear referred to with the expanded authorities. We're going to see that in a later slide, but I may mention it a couple times throughout this. So this is not an exhaustive list, because as you'll see, the matrix, I think, is 3 pages long, a PDF, and many, many lines. But so these are some of the more common ones. So the first one, again, we have the expanded authority to incur project costs 90 calendar days before the award is issued. So we see this pretty commonly with NSF. It's in their standard award terms. And a quick note, it's also only if we are using the standard award terms and conditions for these federal grants and cooperative agreements. If for some reason there's any special terms and conditions, those supersede the standard terms. So we have to be a little bit careful when we're looking at these. But for some of these, we do have this expanded authority that we can go ahead and incur project costs 90 calendar days before the award. We have to be very careful with this one in case the award comes in and we don't have the date we expected. We've seen that. I think a number of teams have seen that. Even though we have the authority to exercise this, it is still at our risk that we are exercising this, because again, if something changes, we get a date that's later than expected, we may all of a sudden be outside of the 90 days, even though we have incurred those expenses. So we need to be quite careful with that. So again, initiate a one-time extension of period of performance. So this expanded authority only covers that first no-cost extension. If we have a second no-cost extension we need to request, then it actually does have to go for approval. So for these, the way I sort of think about the no-cost extensions is we're essentially just advising our sponsors that we are exercising this extension of up to 12 months. And as Tiffany said, I agree. We almost always recommend requesting that full 12 months, because again, when you get to that second no-cost extension, you're now not under these expanded authorities. And so we have to go through, it's a much more thorough review process and approval process at the sponsor. A lot of agencies, when we request this, will send us an actual amendment. Team 5 works a lot with USDA and NIFA. We send them our no-cost extension request, and then they send us an actual amendment that shows the new end date. NSF doesn't always. Sometimes we just see the change in research.gov. So it kind of depends on the sponsor, but most of the time, once we've told our sponsor that we're exercising this, we'll get an amendment, and then we use that amendment to change that date in our system. And as Tiffany already said, we can't just request these for expending funds. So carrying forward unobligated balances, Tiffany hit a little bit on this one as well. We don't have to request, if we fall under this, we don't have to request approval from the sponsor. Let's say we're in year 2 and we had some unexpended budget in year 1. We don't have to request approval from the sponsor to spend those year 1 funds. We can just go ahead and spend them. NIH does a really nice job with their award their grant award where it says very clearly you can carry forward unobligated balances to subsequent budget periods or not. Some of the other federal agencies are not quite as nice and clear. So again, just know terms and conditions. This is partly why OSP is always advising you to look at the terms and conditions when we send an award. The awards get sent out from our admins. It takes a village. As Tiffany said, we all need to make sure we're reading terms and conditions and knowing what is covered. Some say it very clearly. It's very nice, right on page 3. And others, you have to dig into the terms and conditions that are maybe 4 web pages down. So sometimes you have to dig a little bit for it. Just because you have multi-year funding does not mean that you will have this expanded authority. So that's something to be very careful with. And this is one of the terms and reports that you can see on RPS hits on prior approval. And so again, that's a starting place to look at, and then ask your SRA if you have more questions. So budget, this is hitting at the sort of line between budget reallocation and budget revision that Tiffany was hitting on earlier. So under expanded authority, we have authorization to move up to 10% of the total budget between categories. So we're talking, if we saw this commonly during COVID, if there was no travel being expended because no one could travel, we saw a lot of awards. They were then requesting, budget reallocation to use some of those travel funds towards paying more salaries so that, more of the work could go on as happening here and not traveling. So again, you look at the total amount of your budget. So if you have a $300,000 total amount for your budget, you can move up to $30,000 between categories before we have to ask the sponsor for approval. We have to be a little bit careful if we're hitting on participant support, subawards, things that will affect indirect costs. So it's not simply as clear cut as we're moving 10% or lower than 10%. We don't have to ask. So again, continue to check in with your SRA on that. And sometimes we have to ask our sponsor, even if it's well within the 10%. I had an amendment recently with USDA ARS where we're moving between foreign travel and domestic travel. And even though we're moving within 10% under, they still needed us to at least let them know that that's what we're doing. So that's the communication piece that is always going to be happening.
Oh, and I have one thing to add there, Catherine, that
Yeah.
I didn't mention before. So typically this 10% reallocation is with existing approved line items. And if there's ever a new line item, meaning like it wasn't there before, and now I have this cost savings and I want to buy a piece of equipment and there wasn't an equipment line item, that's the type of thing that we're going to look at for both scope change, and that probably is going to need prior approval.
And I always ask about scope of work at this point. Again, even if we're moving less than 10%, if it's going to be, a scope change for that less than 10%, we still have to ask for that approval. So always, always, always be looking at scope.
And Connie, that's total budget.
So when is prior approval necessary? So we've talked about expanded authorities where we can just essentially, make the changes on our side. These are going to be anything else that we do really have to ask the sponsor, and we have to get their approval before we make the change. So common things, change in scope, we've talked about that one a lot. If we're changing a key person, either, changing PI, removing a co-PI, adding a co-PI, anything like that, we usually need to get approval first from the sponsor. It was one of the less common ones, but disengagement of a PI for more than 3 months, that's a common one. If we're transferring costs into a line that didn't have budget, or we're participant support where we're, affecting IDC, all of these things we have to ask and wait for approval before we can go ahead and make the change to the budget or the end date or anything like that. And as I said, even under expanded authority, we still often have to be communicating with our sponsor. We just don't necessarily have to wait for their approval. So like for the no cost extension, first no cost extension under expanded authority, we're not waiting for approval. We're just advising them that we're going to do that. And so that's a little different than asking and waiting for approval before we actually make the change. So this is the prior approval matrix that you have probably heard I mean, obviously we mentioned it today, but you probably have heard of it prior. This is where OSP often, if we're asked about, can we do this? Can we do that? We go out and look at this. I have this linked in my browser and I'm pulling this up. So this, it covers the agencies you can see across the top, NSF, DOE, etc. And then it lets us know whether we have expanded authority or not based on these line items. And this is 3 pages long, so I'm not going to really go through it, but I do want to have just a tiny activity. So Shannon put the link in the chat. If you can click on that and find one item on there where prior approval is still required, if you can pop that in the chat, just so that you can kind of start to get a feel for how you read this and interpret this. So find one item that requires prior approval. Yep, change of PI, definitely.
And another thing is if you look at the matrix, if you could say the sponsor too, put the sponsor, just so you can get used to reading the columns and going over.
Yeah, and this matrix hits on a lot of the federal sponsors, but not all of them.
No. And that's the other thing is you have to be very careful about which sponsors and what this covers, this prior approval matrix. You have to be very careful because, again, it is only for grants, sometimes cooperative agreements, but remember, cooperative agreements will a lot of times have special terms and conditions due to that cooperative piece. So they may have be a little bit more limiting than grants, and this does not cover contracts at all. So we have to be very careful in using the prior approval matrix.
Yep, and as Rowena picked out, some of these lines, they're, required by all except for one. So you have to be sure that you're triangulating the columns and the rows correctly. So this is just, again, a starting point. Certainly the SRAs we always want you to check in with us, but this is a starting point for you to look at and start getting a sense of whether we would have expanded authorities under this prior approval matrix, or if we have to ask for that permission before we make the change. I know we have time at the end, but if there are any questions about prior approval matrix, expanded authorities, I'm happy to take those now.
All right. We're going to head into some reporting and closeout topics. So financial reporting. As we know, there are terms and conditions in every award that are going to touch on what is required in terms of reporting. So there are going to be reporting requirements for both the technical or programmatic side, and there are financial aspects of the project. So financial reporting is different from the programmatic or technical reporting, and OSP typically handles the periodic and closeout financial reporting. So I've even had that question come up this week from folks. They weren't sure who does the SF425, which is the name of the form on the federal side, often for filing federal financial reports. So it doesn't mean that SP won't be reaching out to the fiscal officers or the departmental research administrators for more information. It is still a team approach, but SP does do the filing of the financial reports. The PI and the research team are responsible for reporting progress on the aims and objectives of the scope of work. On the federal side, we usually hear that referred to as an RPPR, a periodic progress report. And so that is mostly in the domain of the PI. It depends on the sponsor portal and a few other things. Sometimes SP can assist with pieces of that. So for financial reporting, the terms and conditions of the award will spell out the frequency of the reports. They're generally completed quarterly. If it's for an SF425, sometimes semi-annually. Sometimes we see them that are just required annually. So it really does depend on the terms and conditions. And for the final financial report on the federal side, it's usually due, for any sponsor, usually due between 60 and 120 days after the project end date. Most federal agencies have a 120-day closeout period where any final expenses that are coming through, there shouldn't be final expenses after the end of the period of performance, by the way, but anything that might be sort of lagging in that queue, any final questions that we need to field to get everything squared away. State and private sponsors may have different requirements. Should note here that some sponsors may view the invoicing process as financial reporting with no additional reporting required. So we do see that fairly often where there is no SF425 type of format required. It's just they're going to take a look at your invoice, and if they have questions, they'll reach out to you. That's typically more on the private or state side, not on the federal side. When we are a subaward to another organization and they are flowing through funds from a prime sponsor to us, our final reporting deadlines may be shorter. We may only have a 30 to 60-day window because we need to get our information over to them with enough time for them to complete their overarching report that needs to go to that prime sponsor. So keep that in mind. If we're a subawardee that has a pass-through entity as our sponsor, we may have a shorter period of time that we need to get our reports done and in. So at OSP and the departmental FO or the DRA may need to coordinate during this process. And this is especially true if there are cost share requirements. There are often questions that we get about sort of who's on first, who's doing what, who's in charge of that. And we touched a little bit on it here. And I think for those of you that have attended some of the prior fundamentals, you have probably seen the roles and responsibilities matrix. And Shannon's put the link in the chat if you want to take a look at it while we're touching on it briefly. So how do you know who does what when it comes to award changes, modifications, reporting? It's a great place to come to just make sure that we're clear on who's doing what. The PI does have a lot of accountability and responsibility for their area of things. They often are the ones that need to identify when a change is going to happen, and then they communicate it through the department and to SP for us to then take on our part of the responsibility. So, we started out by discussing shared responsibility, and the roles and responsibilities matrix just gives you in tangible form how you really can see that it is a team effort, that no one department, team, or person is responsible for the entire thing. Award management has a lot of moving pieces, and so we're all in it together.
So sort of the last little section we're going to hit on, we still have a number of slides, but last section is closeout. So closeout, sort of the technical definition, is what we do once all grant activities have been completed. This is regardless of whether we still have funds or not. If the work has been done, even if we still have funds, we close out. This is not we're going to keep spending until we have no funds. This is once it's tied to that scope of work. If we have completed everything under the scope of work, then we deem that we're ready for closeout. This is just sort of a overarching list. I'm not going to read them. You all will have copies, but just some things that we always need to make sure of, and that our FRAs are, they're going through this checklist and making sure. So just checking sure that encumbrances have been liquidated, removed from that account. If there was any staff, making sure that they're, not being paid anymore, that is tied to the encumbrance. Project deliverables have been met, that final technical report has been submitted, that we've met cost share. There's even more than this. This is just a little bit of, overview of what we're looking at.
Okay, let's play this. Let's see what happens.
Hi, I'm Bob Andresen. Yep. I'm here with Incura. I'm from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm here to talk a little bit about closeout and some of the best practices to follow when you're closing out projects. One of the key things in closing out projects is to remember closeout starts actually during the life of the project. Don't wait until the project's over or just about over. Look at expenditures every month. Take a look at questionable activities. Make sure that everybody's being paid on the grant that's supposed to be paid. Make sure that all the technical reports are going in during the life of the project. It really simplifies things and keeps things much easier when you get to closeout time. Closeout time is generally 90 days, but sometimes if you're dealing with subawards or you're dealing with other agencies, the window can be a lot shorter. It can be 60 days or in some cases even less than that. It's not a lot of time to get a whole lot of work done, particularly for those grants that have really long periods of performance. If you're looking back at a project that started 5 years ago, you've got a lot of activity to review and monitor This is your last chance to get everything right. So take time to do it in advance. Make sure that you look at everything as it's happening. Understand how much time you actually have to do the closeout. And use this opportunity as one last chance to fill in the blanks. Use the documentation. Keep the documentation on hand. Keep it on file. If you see a piece is missing, try and recreate it. Contact your central sponsor projects office or contact people in the department. Maybe they have that key piece of missing information that you can use to complete the file. This is it. You know, close out, get it right, get it done fast, get it done on time. Good luck.
Jen put that link directly to that video in the chat. So again, as he says, closeout really does, it's during the, after we've done it, but we need to be paying attention throughout the entire project, making sure we're meeting our cost share. If we get to the end of the project and we have not met our cost share, we're gonna have a lot of work and issues to work back through. If we find out, towards the end that we've had the wrong person staffed on it, that is less of an issue with eCert, but all these things that we're just keep on top of what's going on with your accounts throughout the life cycle. So we do have a closeout checklist on the sponsored programs website. Shannon just popped that in and we'll show you where it is on one of the next slides. It's not a requirement. This is really a reference. It's a tool for you. It's something that you can start looking through. If you know that you have awards that are coming to an end, it just walks you through 120 days, 90 days, 60 days, 30 days out. Things for you to start thinking about. You can see just on the screen snip, have we been submitting progress reports? Making sure that payroll has been reviewed throughout. Are the encumbrances for the staff, ended as of the end date? Things like that. And you can see the star there that this also points back to the roles and responsibilities matrix, which will lay out, again, who's responsible for what. On our website, a vast majority of what we've been talking about today, including this checklist, are found under either the guidances or the forms page. The particular closeout checklist that we were just looking at is on the guidance page, but the forms page also has a lot of them. And you can also navigate the life cycle tiles that are in the middle of our main page. Will link back to the guidance and the form pages. So that's where a lot of these are found for you to reference.
This is just kind of a wrap-up reminder that, Colorado State is a public nonprofit organization that has a core mission that includes robust, far-reaching, and a high impact research enterprise. We have investigators that are doing amazing things. It's one of the reasons I love my job. I love to see the kinds of projects that are happening out in the colleges every single day. They're doing transformative things. They're tackling topics and finding solutions to some of the most challenging and pressing topics of our time, but they can't do it alone. It is definitely a shared process that has many hands contributing to the successful outcomes. And as a research administrator or a contributing departmental staff member, you are an absolute valued part of what it takes to make any sponsored project move forward from proposal to completion. And we can't tell you how much we appreciate all of you. So thank you so much for your time visiting with us today. Thank you for your teamwork. And what's next here, Shannon and Kat?
And we will move on to thoughts, questions.
And there were a couple resource slides, Shannon,
Yes.
at the end that y'all will see out on the website.
Yeah, the resource slides are not great for when you're sitting in a presentation, but they are on the website. We have the PowerPoint slides and we have a lot of resources also on the worksheets. I do want to say thank you. Kat loves this view, by the way. So if you want to join us.
It doesn't save in our recording. That's my only regret, that I did not take a picture of Trisha. And
well, if people would like to turn on their cameras and become a part of our classroom, I do want to say thank you to so many people who have attended all of these sessions. It has been great. It has been a long month, and so I realize that this is a lot of your time. And we truly do appreciate that you've joined us. This view is so funny with the classroom. Kat, are you going to try and take a screen capture?
I will. Everyone smile.
But again, I want to have a special thanks for our presenters today, for Catherine and for Tiffany, for sharing their expertise today. And on behalf of the OSP Training and Professional Development Committee, thank you for your participation in today's session.